Alright, I've often had some discussions with people about Smith & Wesson revolvers versus other revolvers. And I often say that the Smith & Wesson revolver is a superior revolver to other revolvers. And I thought I would strip one down just to kind of show you what I mean by that. And when I say it's superior, I'm not necessarily saying that some are inferior to Smith & Wesson. I'm just saying that there's some points to be made about the Smith & Wesson revolver as to its reliability versus other revolvers. Now when you're talking about revolvers and some of the points that can fail on them, what you're really talking about is their internal safeties that can fail. Now generally when you're talking revolvers, you're talking either a hammer block safety or a transfer bar. And I've had several transfer bars fail on Taurus revolvers. And not only does Taurus use them, but also Charter Arms, Ruger, Colt. A lot of companies, in fact most companies, use a transfer bar because it's inexpensive and it's a pretty simplistic part. And what a transfer bar is, and I'm going to show this piece of metal here just as an example, because this is pretty much what a transfer bar looks like. That's not what this is, but it looks a lot like a transfer bar, so I can really easily explain with this part what a transfer bar does. Okay, a transfer bar, what a transfer bar does, you see how there's a little bit of a void in between the hammer here and the frame of the gun. If this were a transfer bar, what would happen is when you pull the trigger, the transfer bar would lift up, and when you hold the trigger to the rear, that transfer bar would stay lifted up and it would fill the void right there, allowing the hammer to strike the firing pin inside the gun. Now the thing about that makes it not as reliable is that in order to get ignition, you have to take this big hammer here and it has to slam a little skinny piece of metal, and generally the transfer bars are about this big. You have to put all that force of that hammer slamming into a transfer bar in order to make it fire. So if you have any failure of that bar, you're, as a quick term to say, SOL. Your gun's going to fail. It's not going to fire. It's going to shear off. It's going to fall through or fall out the opening of the hammer, and you're done. And a lot of companies use them. And I think that's just because a lot of people don't rely on revolvers anymore as their primary self-defense tool. So they don't really bother in putting something that I consider better in it, like the hammer block safety. And what a Smith & Wesson does, they don't use a transfer bar. This is just a second backup to their hammer block safety. And what they have here is their hammer block safety. And if you can look right about here, there's a little bit of a cutaway in this hammer. And here's the bottom here where it catches on this black part. So what you got going on is when you cock the hammer, this part slides back. And when you keep your finger fully depressed to the rear, this part here stays where it is, and it allows that piece right there of the hammer to not be impeded, which allows it to go fully forward and hit that firing pin. Now what happens if you let off the trigger, let's say you drop the gun, this part here moves forward. Watch it move forward. And it does not line up in that void right there. It blocks it from moving any further. So that's your hammer block safety. So the gun itself, when you're firing it correctly, there are no parts that are slammed in between the hammer and the firing pin up here. It's the hammer directly to the firing pin and nothing else. So that is very, very, very reliable. As where if it was a transfer bar, you're hoping that that piece of metal survives thousands of hammer strikes. Now what this is on a Smith & Wesson is basically like a backup. You put it on here, you put it on the hammer block safety, and what happens is if your finger is fully pulled to the rear, it pretty much stays out of the way. Not a big deal. But if you let off the, let me put this back on here. If you let off the trigger, what happens is just the same way this is a little bit off down here in the hammer block, this stays up a little bit, also blocking it. So that's kind of like your secondary backup to it. So not only are Smith & Wessons safer in a way, they're also more reliable because you're not going to have a snapped off transfer bar. And I find it interesting that so many companies use those transfer bars. I mean, I understand they're very cheap to make and easy to slip in there, but overall the design of them, in my opinion, is not a very good design. And considering I've had 2 or 3 snap off on Tauruses, you know, that shows that the design itself is not great. Now I've had a Ruger and I fired thousands and thousands of rounds to it. I never had a transfer bar break because it's very good steel. But overall, I much prefer the hammer block system here when we don't have to worry about a transfer bar snapping off. And you know, in the Smith & Wessons, they do have that lock on the other side. I'm not going to flip it now, so I don't want my parts to fall out. But you know, you got that lock up, and that doesn't really bother me that much. I've never really had an issue with it. I hear you can take them out, and I've never felt the need because I've never had an issue with it. I think overall, Smith & Wesson is a little bit more superior. Not only is their internals superior in my opinion as far as the reliability, but their guns are made out of forged steel versus cast steel. So basically you got the same strength gun in a smaller, more sleek package because you're taking very strong steel, you're heating it, and you're basically forging it. And it's much stronger for how small it is. So like a Ruger, they're pouring liquid metal into casting molds, and they're casting it that way, which works fine. But overall, I think that the smaller, more sleek design is going to be with the Smith & Wesson. So Smith & Wesson definitely knows what they're doing. Even in modern times, their revolvers are superior in my opinion. And I'm not knocking other revolvers because a lot of them do work just fine, but really this is the better design in my opinion. So I thought I'd share that, and as always, thanks for watching.